Just a reminder to our Speculating Wildly About Crime listeners, this is for entertainment purposes only and solely the thoughts and opinions of our team. We do invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Between 2005 and 2009, 8 women would be found dead in or around Jefferson Davis Parish, Louisiana. Collectively, these women came to be known as the Jeff Davis 8 or the Jennings 8. Today, on Speculating Wildly About Crime, we will be discussing this set of cases. I'm Carolina, and I will be your host for this episode. Swag Pack, I hope you have your pen and paper ready because there is a lot of information related to these cases. With that being said, this is going to be a 2-part episode. As we begin our discussion, we will see that many of these 8 victims, as well as other third parties who are involved, are very interconnected. Jennings, Louisiana, where most key events of these cases will take place, is a small town of approximately 10,000 residents. The town of Jennings, Louisiana, sits in the Jefferson Davis Parish, which has a total population of around 30,000 people. The town of Jennings is bisected into North and South Jennings by a railroad track that runs through the town. The economic disparity between North and South Jennings is stark. North Jennings is a very wealthy area that is filled with mansions and expensive homes, while the population in South Jennings is extremely low income. Jennings, Louisiana sits along Interstate 10, which is the highway that connects Houston, Texas to New Orleans, Louisiana. The I-10 has long been favored by drug traffickers as a route to transport large quantities of drugs from marijuana to cocaine between these two locations. Due to its proximity on this route, drugs are often easily funneled through Jennings. Law enforcement in Jefferson Davis Parish had enacted what is known as civil asset forfeiture. It allows the government, usually the police, to seize any property that is suspected to be involved in a crime or illegal activity. So what was happening in Jennings is when drivers were driving through that area along I-10, they were just getting pulled over by the police and they were just seizing property from their car. They could have found drugs, but they could have just seized anything because as long as they suspected it was part of a crime, they could seize it. Now, in 1997, Dateline actually did a special that highlighted this, and they used undercover cars that were only allowed to go 65 miles per hour. They still got pulled over, and they had the whole video of the police going through the car. This practice really gives police discretion and is left largely unchecked. Aside from facing systematic poverty, a high number of the population in Jennings also suffered from substance use disorders because of its location along the I-10 and drugs being funneled in. According to a statement by the Jefferson Davis Parish District Attorney, Michael Cassidy, drug-related offenses constituted 80 to 85% of their cases. However, substance abuse treatment was not readily available in the area at all, which just served to make the addiction that all of these residents were facing, they just had no place to get help. As we will see, each of the Jeff Davis 8 victims were affected by and faced varying levels of substance use disorders throughout their lives. Before we move to any of the substantive facts of this case, I really want to give credit to Ethan Brown. He's an investigative journalist that really took up the charge to look into this case. He read an article and said, oh, there's more things going on here that I want to look into. And he has done tremendous work uncovering the details of all of these cases. He chronicled his findings in a book entitled Murder in the Bayou, which was later turned into a 5-part series on Showtime with the same name. Relying on law enforcement files, as well as witness and family interviews, Brown's book provides one of the most detailed accounts of the Jeff Davis 8 case as a whole, and it is the largest source that I used, as well as a documentary for our coverage today. If you are interested in these cases at all, I highly suggest checking both of those out, because although I'm going to try to hit on most of the pertinent details of these cases, there's just too much to fit even into a two-part episode. As we move along our timeline, we will see that aside from the victims' personal connections to each other, they also shared a lot of other similar factors. One, which we already touched on, they all faced substance use disorders in their lives, in their families' lives, that really affected them. Another thing that these women have in common, which we will see this not handled in a compassionate or great way through the media, is that they all had some level of connection to sex work, which was very rampant in South Jennings. We will talk about a lot of the players that were involved in that as well. Another factor that each of these women also allegedly had in common, they were rumored to be police informants, at least at some point in their life. As we will see, that connection to being police informants is clearer in some cases than others. However, according to Brown's book, each of the Jeff Davis 8 victims were allegedly recruited to be an informant by a woman named Paula Guillory, who worked at the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office. She categorically denies these claims, and we do not have proof one way or another to say that she did recruit each victim, but it is something that I just wanted to mention, as Brown did in his book. As we discuss the details of all of these cases, I'm going to largely try to follow the timeline, so each event is told in succession. However, there will be times where I will jump around a bit, so Slack Pack, feel free to jump in with questions as we move along. Are we ready to jump into it? Jefferson Davis Parish saw the first of these 8 murders in May of 2005. In the early morning hours of May 20th, 2005, Terry Guillory, husband of Paula Guillory, who we just mentioned, and a deputy with the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office, knocked on the front door of Barb Ann Deshtal, claiming that he was checking up on Barb's friend, Loretta Chazon. Loretta and Barb were extremely close, and Loretta often spent a lot of time at Barb's home. Terry asked Barb if she knew where Loretta was. Barb didn't, but was concerned that a police officer was at her house asking about her whereabouts. Terry provided no real substantive detail to Barb and then left the home. At the time of Terry Guillory's visit, Barb nor Loretta's family had reported Loretta missing. Loretta had 2 brothers who were actually interviewed on the Showtime documentary, Nick and Chad Chazon, whom she was in regular contact with. Neither one of them had filed a missing persons report. As Brown outlines in his book, there was also no public record of Loretta being reported as missing, which supports all of these families' claims. Later on the afternoon of May 20th, 2005, a man fishing off a bridge overlooking the Grand Marais Canal spotted a body floating in the water. The victim was identified as 28-year-old Loretta Lynn Lewis Chazon. When she was discovered, Loretta was dressed in blue jeans, blue underwear, and a short-sleeve white blouse. Her body had been fairly decomposed because it had been in the water for a period of time, and there was no visible injury to Loretta except for some blood that was noted under her scalp. Absent any significant identifiable wounds, the coroner ruled Loretta's death as undetermined. Her toxicology screen was positive for the antidepressants Zoloft and Celexa, as well as cocaine. Her blood alcohol content was measured at 0.16. Ricky Edwards, sheriff for the Jefferson Davis Parish, was the one that broke the news about Loretta's death to her father, Tommy Chazon. Now, Ricky Edwards was the long-standing sheriff for Jefferson Davis Parish. He was the sheriff during the time that each of these women will be found. put a pin in Ricky because he will come up more as we move along with this case and how he has handled this investigation.
So with Loretta being found with no physical abuse in her clothes, you mentioned panties, jeans, and a shirt. So was sexual assault immediately ruled out?
I don't even know if they fully looked into that. I didn't see anything that said there was no signs of it, but I didn't see anything that said there were signs of it either. As we'll see as we move along, and I know some of you know this case a bit, the level of investigation that is done into any of these murders is very lackluster, and it's usually the family that is having to lead the charge in even trying to discover these women after they go missing. So there's a lot left open, I think, about the investigations. At the time of her death, Loretta was separated from her husband, Murphy Lewis. The pair had married in 2000 and had 2 boys together. At the start of their marriage, Loretta had been using drugs recreationally. However, over the course of the relationship, Loretta developed a substance use disorder and began using drugs more heavily. In 2004, at the urging of her husband, Murphy, Loretta did enter an outpatient drug rehabilitation facility. Unfortunately, this did not help her overcome her addiction, and Murphy and Loretta separated after that, which I just want to take a pause right here to note the fact that the lack of substance abuse treatment, it could have been that Loretta had to go far away to even access this treatment, which is obviously just even more difficult for her, especially when they're living in that systemic poverty, for her to even get there, which is just really sad for all of these residents of Jennings. Loretta also had various contact with law enforcement in the time leading up to her death. In March of 2005, so a couple of months before her body was found, Loretta was arrested for writing a check from a stolen checkbook at a grocery store. Her attorney at the time had made a case for leniency, which worked, and Loretta was given a 6-month prison sentence, which, aside from 60 days, was completely suspended. And that meant that Loretta didn't have to serve the full sentence then, but if she got out and committed any future crimes, she could potentially have to serve that sentence on top of whatever she was sentenced to for the new crime. Loretta's attorney had requested that she engage in substance abuse treatment as part of this deal. However, nothing in any of the records that Ethan Brown uncovered indicated that she ever received such treatment. Loretta's friends and family also said that after stints in the parish jail, Terry Guillory, and if you remember, he's the one that showed up at her friend's house asking where she was before her body was even found, would personally drive Loretta home, which struck them all as strange. A couple of the people in the documentary said, I was in jail and I never got a ride home by any of the police officers. Put a pin in Terry. He's going to be all over this case. So if you got his name, you can take notes underneath as we go along. In the time leading up to her death, Loretta also told her brother that she was working with the police as an informant to possibly take down a prominent drug dealer in the Jennings area. Loretta, as many of the other Jeff Davis 8 victims did, found refuge and support in a woman named Roxanne Alexander. Roxanne was known by many of the victims as Mama, and they often spent significant periods of time at her home. Just prior to Loretta's death, Loretta confided in Roxanne that she wanted to take her kids away from Jennings. 3 days after having this conversation, Loretta was found dead. So taking us to the timeline here, some of these timelines are going to be a little bit shaky with some of these victims. A lot comes from witness statements. A lot of times the witnesses aren't named. Ethan Brown in his book made it clear that he wasn't naming the witnesses for fear of any blowback on them for having spoke to law enforcement or to Ethan Brown himself. So some of these will be a little bit shaky, but I'm going to just relay what we know. So taking us to May 17th, 2005, which is 3 days before Loretta's body was found in the canal. Witnesses, including Loretta's brother Chad, saw her getting into a car with a man named Frankie Richard at a local gas station. Now, Frankie is somebody that is also going to come up a lot throughout our coverage of these cases. And as we will see, he is deeply connected to all of these victims. Frankie Richard is described by Ethan Brown, I think in very accurate terms, as a, quote, pimp and a drug dealer. Frankie Richard was at the forefront of both the drug and sex trade in Jennings. Law enforcement who were interviewed on the Showtime documentary described Frankie as someone that was well known to the police. Frankie had a very interesting way of framing his involvement with the world of sex work in Jennings, which I hope you can all grasp the sarcasm in my voice and irony of what he says. But according to Frankie Richard, he didn't, quote, pimp out these girls, including some of the Jeff Davis 8 victims, but rather he introduced them to older men that wanted to spend money for time spent with a, quote, young gal. So I'm pretty sure he's defining what he is right there, but he wanted to frame it in a different way. Frankie Richard would then take any money that the women received and use it to buy drugs, which he would then share with these women and use with them. But of course, he's taking the money. He has control of the entire situation.
So they didn't get any cash from this. Their only payment, so to speak, was drugs.
That's what I think. Sometimes they probably did get a little bit of money here and there. But I think if they were working with Frankie, he probably held on to that. We don't know that for sure, but that would be my assumption based on what he said, what witnesses have said. Frankie Richard, he has since passed away, but was interviewed on the Showtime documentary, which I think aired a couple of years before he died. He was willing to say a whole bunch of horrible stuff, and he seemed like a real scary dude. Additionally, Frankie Richard also had a known violent history. So later on May 17th, 2005, after Loretta was seen getting into the vehicle with Frankie Richard, witnesses reported seeing Loretta at a place called the Boudreaux Inn, a motel that was both a hub for drug use and sex work, using cocaine with somebody named Jermaine Stymie Washington and two of the other future Jeff Davis 8 victims, Muggy Brown and Nicole Guillory. Now, the rabbit holes that one can jump down about the Boudreaux Inn are vast. And I know that I'm adding a lot in on Loretta's case here, but these are things that are going to become important throughout these cases. Just a little bit about the Boudreaux Inn. It was described as a centralized location for people to, quote, trade sex for drugs or drugs for sex. The Boudreaux Inn sat just behind a restaurant and a bar. So in the walls of the bar, men could meet women. Usually they were involved in some type of sex work and then be able to go right across the lot to the inn in the back and get services that they either providing money for or a lot of times providing drugs for. So when Ethan Brown began investigating the Jeff Davis 8, he pulled all of the public records he could find and through FOIA requests gained access to years of police files. During this search, Ethan Brown kept seeing one address pop up repeatedly, and that was of the Boudreaux Inn. Didn't necessarily say that it was the Boudreaux Inn, but it was the same address. As he looked through the police reports, all of them placed many of the Jeff Davis 8 victims, including Loretta, at the Boudreaux Inn during the time leading up to their deaths. As Ethan Brown began to dig deeper into the Boudreaux Inn, he found that a man named Martin Big G Guillory was involved in some type of management of the establishment. And when Brown made contact with Big G, the conversation started off very pleasant. However, as Brown started to dig deeper, asking him specific questions about the illicit activities that happened at the Boudreaux Inn, Big G became hostile and told Brown never to call him again. Brown wasn't going to stop there. Like a good investigative journalist, he looked even closer. And he identified that Big G actually worked for a man named Charles Busteny, who ran for a Senate seat in Louisiana. So Big G worked on Charles Busteny's campaign. Now, according to Busteny, he had no idea what was happening at the Boudreaux Inn. He said that he went there once for a town hall meeting, but that was the only contact he ever had there. He didn't know any of the illicit activities that were happening. However, there was talk that Busteny not only knew what was going on, but he also maintained a sexual relationship with victim number 1, Loretta. After Ethan Brown's book came out, Busteny filed a defamation lawsuit against Brown, which Busteny then dropped after he lost his Senate seat. Something tells me he didn't want what would come out in discovery of a defamation lawsuit, because it wouldn't just be what Brown found, all of the things would come out if that were to go forward. Turning back to the investigation in Loretta's murder. After Loretta's body was found, her husband, Murphy, told Ethan Brown that he was never even questioned regarding her death, a fact which he seemed extremely upset about because, according to him, which I think we can all agree is a breath of fresh air, the spouse is supposed to be questioned.
That's like Police 101.
So I think that highlights just
how great their police force was.
Yes, how invested they were in, let's say, solving this murder and all of these murders, that they weren't even talking to her husband.
But it also tells me what they may already know.
It's a different take.
Unless they didn't need to solve them.
Unfortunately, Loretta's case did not garner widespread media attention or significant law enforcement focus, and the family was left feeling as though the police did not really care about finding out who had killed Loretta. Although Loretta's father had heard talk that Frankie was possibly involved in Loretta's death, no one was publicly named a person of interest and no arrests were made. Less than a month later, another victim would be discovered in Jefferson Davis Parish. On June 18th, 2005, the body of Ernestine Patterson was found by 3 friends who were out frogging in a canal which sits along Highway 102. Ernestine was found 6 miles from where the first victim, Loretta, was discovered. Ernestine was wearing a pair of jean shorts that had the number 34 stitched into one leg. Ernestine's wounds were more visible and readily apparent than the first victim, Loretta. A large incision was visible on her neck. Ernestine's death was quickly ruled a homicide. The coroner found that Ernestine's death was the result of 3 incisions on the front of her neck. Some additional wounds were noted to be caused by marine predators from Ernestine being in the water. According to Ernestine's family, they were not permitted by the police or the coroner to view her body. Now, that's going to be a theme that we will see come up with some of the other victims, usually in a way of, oh, you don't want to see them like that. Oh, they're in a bad state.
But who gets to identify it? Don't you have to have some sort of next of kin to identify a body?
So a lot of the times, because the women's facial features were affected by the marine wildlife, they had to be identified through dental records, through bone samples, things that wouldn't make them identifiable by a person. I think that it's possible the family still could have identified them, but in Ernestine's case, it took 2 to 3 months to formally identify her, and I think they did hers using bone samples. The last reported sighting of Ernestine was on June 16th, 2005, which is 2 days before the body was found in the canal. Much like the first victim, Loretta, Ernestine struggled with substance use disorder in the time leading up to her death. Ernestine was married for a period of time and had 4 children. She regularly attended church, and her family were very involved in the ministry. Ernestine's parents were interviewed on the Showtime documentary, and they both just broke my heart completely. Her mom was just talking about how she just has no closure whatsoever, that this is still an unsolved case. She just has no peace. And she had this photograph of Loretta, and I'm not sure where it was from, but she was saying, like, this is the only photograph I have of my daughter, which is just so heart-wrenching. Ernestine also had unfair and rather disgusting interactions with law enforcement in the year leading up to her death. Ernestine's sister told Ethan Brown that in the winter of 2004, while her and Ernestine were walking in South Jennings, they were stopped by an unmarked police car who threatened to arrest them because, quote, they got no business walking late at night. Allegedly, during this interaction, he called Ernestine a, quote, crackhead and a, quote, sex worker. According to Ernestine's sister, he then proceeded to tell them that the next time he saw them, he would, quote, kill them. Although Ernestine's sister said that she reported this incident, she said the police just laughed at her, which I think just goes to show and highlight some of the views that the police had of these women, and I think probably the South Jennings area as a whole, which is awful.
Society has taught us to have this outlook on that type of lifestyle as well. If you came in as this girl's sister, you're probably tied to drugs and sex work, and so your opinion doesn't matter either. And so yes, I am going to laugh you out of the police department, no matter how valid your statement or concerns are. And that's really fucking sad.
When we talk about the need for change and education for the police, this is such a big issue that needs to be highlighted, and I feel like it just isn't. Going back to June 16th, 2005, the last night that anyone saw Ernestine, there are a few different accounts of how the entirety of June 16th transpired. The 3 main players that we will be talking about are Byron Chad Jones, Lawrence Nixon, and Lucinda Keggy. Byron Chad Jones had a violent criminal history, which included charges of both robbery and rape. So we will start with kind of what came out from witness statements, as well as some statements that Lucinda Keggy made down the line. Lucinda Keggy is the wife of Lawrence Nixon, so there's that level of connection there too. According to this version of events, Lucinda was in her kitchen cooking when her husband, Lawrence Nixon, and Byron Chad Jones came to the home carrying a, quote, massive, bulging, blood-soaked garbage bag. The 2 men then placed the bag on the porch until a vehicle appeared, at which point 2 men took the bag and loaded it in the back of the car and drove off. Lucinda then used a hose to rinse off the porch. Ethan Brown confirmed that Lucinda's daughter had seen Lawrence Nixon that night covered in blood. Furthermore, a neighbor had provided Nixon with an industrial-sized garbage bag just hours before they allegedly appeared at Keggy's home. The prevailing theory that kind of came to fruition was that Lawrence Nixon had held Ernestine down while Chad Byron Jones had sliced her throat, which would be evidenced by the cut in her neck that the coroner had noted when her body was found. So Nixon and Jones both report a different version of events. According to Nixon's account, Jones had come to his home that night covered in blood, indicating that he, quote, did something wrong and then left the home. Depending on when all of these events occurred, Jones potentially had an alibi for at least a portion of the night. At 3:04 a.m. on June 17th, so kind of June 16th leading to the 17th, he was at the hospital undergoing a psych evaluation. Muggy Brown, who will later become a Jeff Davis 8 victim herself, so we haven't gotten to her story, was actually interviewed in relation to Ernestine's murder. So during the interview that Muggy had with law enforcement, she had told investigators that Ernestine had stolen money for some individuals, alluding to that being the potential reason that Ernestine had been killed. However, according to multiple other sources, Muggy had actually been present and a witness to Nixon and Jones killing Ernestine in an abandoned house on a street called Garage Alley. This theory is not entirely far-fetched, at least to place all of these people together, because Muggy and Lawrence Nixon were cousins. Muggy also often frequented this abandoned home on Garage Alley because it was a known hub where people would go and use drugs. So I want to pause here a little bit with Muggy and just flush out that if Muggy had been present during this occurring, she's not only having to witness an acquaintance, maybe even a friend's being murdered, but then she has the fear that if she opens her mouth to anybody, then the same thing could happen to her. And I think that just highlights the dangerous situation that all of these women were involved in. So a witness had told law enforcement that there was a jagged hunting knife on the floor of the abandoned home in Garage Alley. Interestingly enough, Muggy had also allegedly told other people that Ernestine was killed using a hunting knife.
This home that's in Garage Alley is different than the Boudreaux Inn, which they were all also connected to. So
Yes.
this abandoned home, were all the victims also connected to this abandoned home? Was this like a drug hangout?
I think it's a little bit less clear definitively how many of the victims actually were ever present in that home.
Okay.
But from all of what Brown uncovered in his book and the documentary, it made it seem like it was a known hangout spot in Jennings, which wasn't that large for people to go and use substances. So I do think a lot of these women probably went through this home at periods of time. Despite all of this, Ethan Brown said that it's entirely unclear from the case file if the tip about the hunting knife was ever followed up on or if this knife was ever recovered. I'm thinking if it's not in the files that he obtained, it probably never was, and that knife is long gone now. Additionally, it took 16 months for the porch of Lucinda Keggie's home to be tested, even though witnesses had reported pretty quickly seeing the presence of blood on the porch that June evening.
And by the time we're 16 months out, who the fuck knows what that blood is, that if you even find anything on there, because we could have cleaned it. My dog could have bled on there. I could have cut my toe on there. Like, why are you even testing it 16 months later?
That is a great question. And it took the line right out of my mouth because unsurprisingly, when the floor was tested, all that time later, it, quote, failed to demonstrate the presence of blood. Of course it didn't have any blood on it 16 months later. With all of that, Byron Chad Jones and Lawrence Nixon were actually briefly charged in connection to Ernestine's murder. However, the second-degree murder charge seemed to just be an act because it completely collapsed due to lack of evidence, which was a result of the lack of any proper investigation in the case.
Do you know what led them to charge them with that murder? And I know they weren't held very long, right?
I think only if 6 months, that's it. And I'm wondering whether there were so many witnesses coming at that time to say, we saw this, that forced them to do something. That's a really good question of how they ended up getting charged, because what we're going to see is there's really only 2 other people that ever end up getting charged with anything, and that case also falls apart.
This could lead into speculation, but it could have been that they were just like the worker bees, if you will, for whoever really did it, right? And they were tasked with, you have to get rid of this body and you have to dispose of it or whatever, right? And so, yeah, okay, we're going to be sloppy about it because we don't know what the fuck we're doing, but we have to abide by this guy or he's going to kill us. They probably did have it out on the porch and they probably did come in blood soaking. But again, from what you're telling me, this area is poverty level. There's not a lot of great things that happen here. And so if anybody comes forward as a quote unquote witness, we're not always taken seriously.
Yeah, I think that you are on the right track completely.
It's frustrating.
And it's very frustrating. And Ernestine's family also felt all of that frustration, especially after Jones and Nixon were charged briefly. That felt like a win to them, and then they're just let go. So it really led her family to believe that the police really didn't care about solving her murder. So no one else has been formally charged in connection with Ernestine's murder, and her case, like Loretta's, remains unsolved to this day. Less than 2 years later, another body would be discovered in Jennings. On March 18th, 2007, the body of Kristen Lopez was found in the Pettyjohn Canal. When she was found, Kristen was only wearing 1 gold ring and 1 white sock that had little hearts on it. Although Kristen had been reported missing on March 15th, 2007, the last known sighting of her was actually much earlier on March 5th, 2007. At the time Kristen's body was discovered, extreme decomposition had set in from being in the water for such an extended period of time. Kristen's body, like the others, also suffered the effects of trauma from marine predators. The coroner did not indicate any obvious injuries on Kristen, and her death, like Loretta's, was ruled as undetermined. Due to the state of her body, it also took a long time to identify Kristen, and she had to be identified using dental records. Kristen's father was interviewed on the Showtime documentary, and it's really clear that he cares very deeply about Kristen, and he's really haunted about her case being unsolved. Much like Kristen, her father and her mother both also suffered from substance use disorders. Kristen began using drugs at a very young age, and her father even recounted very frankly in his interview how he and Kristen would regularly use crack together. Kristen was also an extremely vulnerable victim. She was intellectually disabled and received supplemental security income. Kristen and Frankie Richard were deeply intersected from the time that Kristen was a child. Frankie's sister actually babysat Kristen when she was little, and as Kristen got older, she became extremely close with Frankie and even regularly called him Uncle Frankie. I know we've talked about Frankie a little bit in the beginning, but I just want to remind everyone that he was a key player in the Jennings drug trade, both as a user and as a seller. Frankie Richard had consistent law enforcement contact. However, he always seemed to walk away from all of that without any significant charges or jail time.
I always just assumed that it was either one, like he knew too much information, on the police? Like maybe they were using his services? Or there was some kind of kickback situation with the
Same.
drugs?
I was just gonna say that actually, Janelle. I was like, how was he tied to the police? Because
He was definitely untouchable.
Definitely. Like what you said, Janelle, I think almost both of those things could be true. That he knew a lot about the police, and also there was a kickback situation happening. We talked about the civil forfeiture of drugs and all of that coming along the I-10. There were drug stops and drug raids that happened. And I think it was Ethan Brown in the documentary said, when you see the law enforcement saying, oh, we've seized all of these drugs, and they have like drugs and weapons and money on a table, and it's, look at this, all we seized, that never makes it anywhere. Like that doesn't go to the evidence room, that goes in the law enforcement's pocket, it goes on the street. And that's just what was happening here.
Yeah, it might go to Frankie, who can sell it.
Public records that were discussed in Ethan Brown's book and in the Showtime documentary showed that Frankie Richard was arrested upwards of 40 times and never spent any significant time in jail.
that is bananas. That statement alone, I feel like you need to say it again.
Kristen was not only connected to Frankie Richard in the drug world trade in Jennings, but she was also connected, at least in some respects, to other people that were involved in the drug trade. On April 20th, 2005, so this is a couple of years before Kristen was murdered, she was present at a home in South Jennings, and while she was there, a drug raid took place at the home. The Louisiana State Police, the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office, and the Jennings Police Department all participated in the raid. During the course of this raid, a man named Leonard Crockett, which apologies if I'm not saying his name, they didn't say it much in the things that I was listening to. Leonard was a known substance user, and he was shot and killed by a man named John Briggs Beckton of the Louisiana State Police. Leonard Crockett was unarmed, and there was absolutely no weapon found in his vicinity. So I think this highlights just, and I added it because it shows how involved Kristen was in this world and with people that were extremely dangerous. She was in really bad situations in the years leading up to her death. And I think it also highlights a lot of the issues that were going on in the Louisiana police force as a whole. And there's whole books about their police force as well, if you wanted to ever really look into that. Barb Ann Deshdahl, who is also friend of victim number one, Loretta, had said that she tried to get Kristen off the streets and stop using drugs multiple times, but according to Barb, drugs just controlled Kristen. Turning back to March 5th, 2007, which this is the last known sighting of Kristen. Allegedly on that night, a woman named Tracy Chazon and Kristen went to Frankie's home pleading to be able to stay in his room at the Budget Inn. Frankie had previously booked a room at the Budget Inn, which this is different than the Boudreaux Inn, but another area where these women had a lot of contact. They had been staying there, but Frankie had kicked them out, saying that they were stealing items. Tracy is actually the cousin of the first victim, Loretta, so another connection we have between all of these people. According to Frankie, they came and wanted to stay with him, but Frankie refused. So what happened next, which comes from Frankie and initial statements made by Tracy, was that Kristen and Tracy walked over to a nearby home on another street called Frank Street. That isn't as important as the Garage Alley home, but it was just a known house to party at. During the course of the investigation, some of Kristen's personal items were found in a home on Frank Street, including her bra, an undershirt, and a pair of shorts. So that at least partially corroborates some of these events, but just because her clothing was there doesn't mean that Kristen was necessarily there.
And my mind immediately went to, did she get raped there? But could they have done something to her and planted that? Maybe.
Tracy did initially place them in that home. According to Tracy's initial statements, she had left the home and she asked Kristen to go with her, but at the time, Kristen refused to leave the home. So it was actually Tracy that alerted Kristen's mom on March 15th, 2007, so about 10 days later, that Kristen was missing, and they filed a missing persons report that day. So we have a significant period of time that Kristen has been missing.
So obviously she's not going home on a regular basis, that her mom wouldn't find that odd that she's missing for 10 days.
Yeah, I think a lot of these women did stay other places. The person that I had mentioned, Roxanne Alexander, who's a safe haven for the women, they stayed there often. The women would sometimes even stay with each other. So I don't think it's overly unsurprising that her mom may not have known where she was for that period of time and not questioned it.
Something else I just thought of, I feel like maybe we need to bring it up. These women were mothers, right? So they all had like children.
Not all of them. Loretta had children with her husband. Ernestine had children. We're going to see later that some of the other victims did, but we are going to also have victims like Kristen. She didn't have a child.
A lot of accounts of all these victims, their families saying they were such a great mother. They loved their child. They lived for their child.
Because if you know that your child is taken care of, staying with dad or grandmother or grandfather, you're showing that love by making sure your child is taken care of. Just because you have a drug addiction or because you're a sex worker and maybe don't have full contact with your children still doesn't make you a bad mother or father. Right.
A lot of these women were mothers. And when you listen to them talk about their families, talk about their children and how they were as mothers and how they were very present still, even though they were facing these substance use disorders. And there's going to be times later where we hear that these women in the time leading up to her death were so scared because they were thinking of their children. They knew something was going to happen to them, and that was their forefront of their mind. I think it was either Barb or Roxanne that was interviewed on the Showtime documentary that said they would see them be with their children and be present when they were at their houses. And I think it's really important to note that although we have to touch on some of these substance use issues that these women suffered and the drug issues that were happening in Jennings, because it does, I think, play a factor into some of the people that were in Jennings that could potentially have been responsible, but I don't want to diminish them to just their substance use. There was so much with these women, and unfortunately, the police and law enforcement, especially when you have this rich area probably funding all of the election campaigns, and then a poor area that is just bisected by one railroad track, they think, oh, no one's going to care about these women. That was the narrative they perpetuated, that we don't even need to work to investigate this. And that's being gracious to them, because I think that that they have a hand in all of this as well. But they clearly portrayed these women in a very awful light. And I think that, unfortunately, this is why this case has largely remained unsolved and doesn't get the coverage that it deserves. You would think after Ethan Brown wrote the book and had a Showtime documentary that something would happen, and still nothing has happened.
I think people are afraid to talk.
I'm glad that we did bring this up though, because I can't speak for everybody, but I feel like we're all on the same page. And so for the listeners that may not know who we are and our stance on things, none of our thoughts go to the stigmas of a sex worker being equivalent to a bad person or a bad mother, or a drug addiction going to being equivalent to a bad person.
These people got these labels and they were treated like less than human because of it.
It's shitty.
And why I think part of the reason they remain unsolved. So Kristen had a lot of connections to a lot of the players in Jennings. Frankie Richard, she was very connected to him. She was also connected to Frankie Richard's brother, Billy Connor, who had a daughter who was Frankie's niece and his godchild, Hannah Connor. So Hannah Connor and Kristen grew up together. Kristen spent a lot of time at Billy's home growing up, at Frankie's home growing up. Hannah was actually interviewed on the Showtime documentary. She said that as they got older, Hannah and Kristen began using drugs together, and oftentimes this was at her father, Billy Connor's trailer. This is another known location in Jennings. A lot of women knew that if they wanted drugs, they could go and get them for a price at Billy Connor's. Much like Kristen and her father, Hannah also stated that her and her father would use drugs together, such as crack. In the Showtime documentary, the interviewer asks her, "Do you think it's weird that your father was using with you?" And she was like, "Oh, yeah, definitely." But that was the type of upbringing that Hannah was having. According to Hannah, Kristen and her father, whom Kristen also called Uncle Billy, maintained a sexual relationship. When Hannah was asked about this, she said, "Oh, it didn't bother me at all, but I teased Kristen about it all the time." I don't think that we even need to state how much of a power dynamic and inappropriate relationship that was between Billy Connor, someone that Kristen grew up with, and having that type of relationship with her.
And that she called uncle.
Yes.
That's disgusting.
Hannah, in the documentary, she further stated she was very surprised that there was a missing persons report on Kristen, because Kristen would often disappear for periods of time. So she didn't really think it was all that surprising. Hannah also said that she threw herself into the middle of the investigation. She was calling law enforcement, asking if there was updates, questioning them.
Who reported Kristen missing?
It was her mother and Tracy. After Kristen's body was discovered, Jefferson Davis Parish had seen the deaths of 3 women in a very short period of time. At this point in the case, Sheriff Ricky Edwards began framing these women in a very specific and awful light in the media. He was quoted as saying that these women were not only tied to substance use, but also connected to what he referenced as prostitution. According to Sheriff Edwards' statements, these 3 women were living high-risk lifestyles. Unfortunately, this is not the only case that we will see this narrative, and it's definitely not going to be the last. And it's just disgusting the way that this is framed. And I think we've touched on this a little bit. I think, Janelle, you said it's so that you can look at these people as less than human. It's trying to dehumanize them and make up for the fact that they're not doing their job to solve these cases. Kristen may also have had information regarding the death of victim number 1, Loretta Chazon. According to Kristen's family, Kristen was called down to the police station to discuss Loretta's murder in a closed-door interview. When Kristen left the interview room, she refused to discuss the contents of the interview with her family, and they reported that she seemed very scared. Less than 2 months after Kristen's body was discovered, another victim would be found. This time, not in a body of water, but on the side of a road. In the early morning hours of May 12th, 2007, a man named Jamie Trahan found the body of victim number 4, Whitney Dubois, in the outskirts of Jennings at an intersection of 2 country roads. Unlike the first 3 victims, who were found in bodies of water, Whitney's body was found on a roadway in a very conspicuous manner. When Whitney was found, she was not wearing any clothing aside from a single elastic band on her wrist. There was also an earring, which could have been Whitney's, that was found near her body. Whitney's alcohol content was measured at 0.42, and she was also positive for cocaine and Xanax. Whitney's death was listed as undetermined by the coroner, who did note bruising on her lower extremities. However, there were no other signs of significant injury or any type of natural disease that would have caused her death. Her time of death was estimated at sometime around May 11th, 2007, so that would have been 1 day before Jamie found her body. According to Whitney's cousin, which is a narrative we've seen before, the family was not permitted to see Whitney's body. Like the other Jeff Davis 8 victims, Whitney also struggled with substance use disorder throughout her life. This largely could be attributed to pain medication that she was given after undergoing an emergency C-section, which I think we see that a lot in society, where these really strong pain medications are given and not regulated well by the doctors that are prescribing them, and that's where the addiction starts to happen.
100%.
Whitney's substance use disorder only served to deepen when she started using crack cocaine with her boyfriend, Alvin Bootsy Lewis. So just to highlight how connected all of these individuals were, Alvin Bootsy Lewis, the victim Kristen Lopez, was at the home of that drug raid that ended up in the shooting death of Leonard Crockett, who was unarmed and shot and killed. And his brother was Murphy Lewis, who was married to the first victim, Loretta. All of these lives are so intersected. Growing up, Whitney was cared for by the Dubois family, who actually ended up adopting her. Mike Dubois, Whitney's adoptive brother, was 20 years older than her, and his daughter and Whitney were raised as siblings. Taking us to May 11th, 2007. So this is the last day that Whitney was seen alive. Whitney had gone at some point during that day to her brother Mike Dubois' house. She stayed there for a period of time, and allegedly Whitney then went to Frankie Richard's home, where witnesses said that they argued on the front lawn. Frankie actually did confirm to Ethan Brown that Whitney did stop by his home either on May 10th or May 11th, but he didn't give any details as to why she was there. According to a witness, on May 11th, 2007, he and his wife were celebrating their anniversary in a motel room at the Budget Inn. During the course of that night, Jamie Trahan, who is the man that found Whitney's body, had come to the room for a period of time to party with them. This man's name is Chad. Maybe we can say Richard, so we don't have to say Richard. There's no relation that I found between him and Frankie, but his name is Chad Richard. I'll probably refer to him as Chad. So according to Chad, at some point in that night, Jamie and him were out driving in their car, using drugs, seeking more drugs. And as Jamie was making a turn, he made a turn really widely, as if he knew there was going to be some type of barrier or something in the road that he needed to avoid. Chad saw what he described as a body. Jamie, however, tried to convince Chad that, no, that wasn't a body. That was actually just a dead deer that you saw. And Chad Richard is actually interviewed in the Showtime documentary. It's discussed in Ethan Brown's book. He said he knew it was not a deer because he could see the sheen of skin, which you wouldn't see from an animal that had fur or hair necessarily. Then, in the early morning hours of May 12th, 2007, Jamie returned to the intersection of those country roads, found what Chad Richard had described as a body, and made a 911 call.
I'm sorry, sir, but if you were so fucking sure that it was a deer, why are you going back to the place that it happened?
Yes. And to make matters stranger, this is actually and Jamie admits this, really the third time he was in this area, because he was there with Chad when he took the turn. He then dropped Chad off, went back to the area, confirmed it was a body, but said, oh, I can't call 911 right now because I have a whole bunch of drugs in my car. So I got to go drop the drugs off, and then I'm going to come back and call 911. But anyway, Jamie's 911 call happened around 7:15 a.m. and law enforcement arrived on the scene and found the body of Whitney. Allegedly, Jamie had gone to Frankie and another man and told them that he found Whitney's body in the road. And
Wait, when though? Like before he called the cops? After he called the cops?
It was after. I think it was after he called the cops. He told Frankie and another man that, yep, I found the body. Oh my God, it was Whitney's body. And I think the one man was like, I don't want to know any of this. Stop telling me this. I don't want to hear this. But Frankie, hearing all of this, loaded Jamie up in his car and they drove over to Whitney's brother's home. And while there, Jamie offered a check of over $2,000 towards Whitney's funeral costs.
Fuck.
Uh-huh.
It's never met her from Adam.
Not anything that was like a definitive connection. I think Jamie maybe even says when he was interviewed, I didn't know who she was. Like, I didn't know this person. Whether that's true or not, because it seems like they all were running in the same circles.
Yeah, because based on my notes, the only connection they had was that he found her body.
Yeah, so it's just a very strange set of circumstances. I think that could play into if he had any involvement or knew about it. Is it guilt? Is it trying to appease the family and throw them off track? I think it could be any number of things.
Or crazy, but could it really have been like, hey, I found this girl's body, and he went to Frankie and Frankie was like, hey, I fucking killed her. Now you have to go do this to cover my tracks type of thing.
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible too. Do you have thoughts on that, Janelle? I know you're familiar with this case.
So I think we have to assume that if you are anybody that's going to Frankie's house on the reg, like, you know, everybody else that is there also. So we know,
Right.
you know that Whitney was going there, and then he's also going there. So I feel like even if there's not an on paper connection,
He knew who Whitney was.
even if it's just in passing. But
Right.
I remember something about that check bouncing. So then it was like, what was even the
point of all of it? And I think Whitney's cousin was interviewed on the documentary too, and she was talking about how Jamie like showed up at their house, and she was thinking it was strange because she didn't really know him.
I feel like it could have been a guilt situation, but I wonder if it was also very badly thought out,
Calculated.
some
Yeah.
sort of alibi. I'm gonna give you money, so I'm a great guy, so you know that it wasn't me. I don't think these people were like Mensa members or anything.
No.
They didn't get the gold honor roll.
Whitney's death was ruled as undetermined, and it didn't seem like there were any significant leads, anyone that was arrested for her murder, so that kind of stalled. However, right on the heels of Whitney's body being discovered, I think it was about 4 days, new information came to light related to the death of victim number 3, Kristen Lopez. On May 15th, 2007, Frankie Richard and his niece, Hannah Connor, were arrested and charged with second-degree murder in connection with Kristen's death. This new information came from witnesses. One really prominent witness was Tracy Chazan. And if we recall, Tracy Chazan had initially talked to investigators and had said that Kristen and her had gone to a home on Frank Street. However, Tracy, in her second interview, had given some different level of information. Although Tracy later alleged that she was pressured by law enforcement to name someone, this report did change substantially and included pointing the finger at Frankie and Hannah. In the second interview, Tracy said that she had been riding around with Kristen, Frankie Richard, Frankie's niece, Hannah Connor, and another woman named Connie Seiler in Connie Seiler's Silverado truck. According to Tracy, the group used cocaine together and then drove to the outskirts of Jennings, where Frankie took Kristen out of the car and severely beat her after she refused his sexual advances. Afterwards, Hannah Connor, Frankie's niece, then held Kristen under the water until she died. There's some differing reports with this that involve Frankie threatening Hannah's children to do this. There's some reports that this may have happened actually at Billy Connor's camper. There's some reports that this maybe happened just at one of the waterways in Jennings. But the substantive facts that Frankie beat her and then Hannah held her head underwater is what Tracy had reported. Hannah Connor and Frankie Richard, based on Tracy's second account of the events that happened that evening, were arrested for second-degree murder related to Kristen's death. Tracy, however, quickly stopped cooperating with investigators and recanted her statements, saying that she had only reported the rumors that she heard on the street and she knew nothing about anything. There was interview footage of Tracy on the documentary, and I would say go watch it because she looks so scared in that interview when they're asking her questions. Why did you do that? Why did you name Frankie? What happened that night? She's already shaking her head before the interviewer is even asking the questions and is just wide-eyed and is saying, I didn't know anything. I lied on Frankie. I don't know what happened. I wasn't there. With Tracy no longer cooperating with the investigators, the charges against Hannah and Frankie were quickly dropped. In the interview that Hannah did on the documentary, she completely denied any involvement in Kristen's murder. She also said that she does not believe that Frankie had anything to do with it. However, when pressed by the interviewer, she did say that she was not with Frankie that night, so she was unable to say whether Frankie had any level of involvement.
So that's weird, though. They're charged and arrested for the murder, right? So I would assume that police reports or investigators put them both together at the time of the murder. But now she's coming back and saying that they weren't?
Yeah, that's what she's reporting on the documentary. There maybe was some other evidence that comes to light a little bit later that placed them all together. But I think largely what the investigators had at the time was just Tracy's account of all of it. And when she stopped cooperating, they had to let them go. Or was it an easy excuse to let them go? There was a reporter who actually really liked the way he was framing all of it. That was from the Jennings Daily News, so the local paper there. Really saw the problem with how the police were framing these cases, how other media maybe was framing the cases. But he had said that when Frankie and Hannah were arrested, it was like this big news. Splashed all over. There's been an arrest in the case. We're making movement. And then when they were let go, it was like crickets. There wasn't like a big press release that went out or anything like that.
So some kind of an agenda with.
Yes.
Maybe it was a two-part situation where one, we're going to kind of act like we're going to treat Frankie like he's not above the law. And two, we're going to show that we're making some progress on this grouping of cases and that we do care so much.
And 3, it's also going to continue to put that fear into the community of Frankie, because all of a sudden he's out and free. So there's going to be that fear, that intimidation with him, who's connected to the people that are enforcing the law.
Yeah, now he's pissed, right?
Janelle, are we on the same boat, driving to the same island? What's happening right now?
I don't know.
Are y'all coming over?
We're discussing it. We're cruising. We're on cruise control discussing.
I have my police corruption Christmas lights out.
Approximately 7 months after the charges were dropped on Hannah and Frankie, additional new information came to light that seemed to lend credence to Tracy Chazon's second version of events related to Kristen's death. In December of 2007, Sergeant Jesse Ewing of the Jennings Police Department received notice that some female inmates had wanted to talk. One inmate relayed to Ewing that while she was at the trailer of Billy Connor, so if we remember, that's Hannah Connor's father and Frankie Richard's brother, seeking drugs, she had a conversation with Hannah. During that conversation, Hannah told her that she had been a witness to Kristen Lopez's murder. According to the inmate's account, Hannah told her that Kristen was murdered, placed in a barrel, and then transported in a truck that was sold to, quote, an officer named Mr. Warren. Now, this is somebody new that we're going to be talking about, and to understand the significance of these statements, we will have to go back in the timeline just a little bit. If you recall, the body of Kristen Lopez was found on March 18th, 2007. She was reported missing around the 15th and had last been seen on March 5th. According to public records, that same month, on March 30th, 2007, Warren Gary, the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office chief investigator, purchased a Chevy Silverado truck from Connie Seiler for the low price of $8,748. Less than a month later, on April 20th, 2007, Warren Gary sold the truck for nearly $15,500, making a significant profit in the process. So I think if we recall, and just to recap a bit, but I think we're all there, Tracy's second account had said that herself, Kristen, Frankie, Hannah, and Connie Seiler were all driving around in Connie's truck the night that Kristen died. And now this officer, Warren Gary, is purchasing that same truck in the same month. When Jesse Ewing, the police officer that was interviewing the inmate, asked whether Officer Warren Gary knew anything about the DNA or any of the other evidence related to Kristen's case that might have been in Connie's truck, the inmate told Officer Ewing that Hannah had told her that he knew all about that. He knew that it was used to transport Kristen's body, and in fact, him and Frankie were good friends, and he brought the truck, so none of the evidence would come back to Frankie. Allegedly, according to this account, Officer Warren Gary not only purchased the vehicle, but also had it washed and cleaned before reselling it. Warren Gary, after all of this, was fined for an ethical violation based on purchasing the vehicle from an inmate, which they said was an ethical concern. However, he received no other additional consequences, and the truck was never recovered by law enforcement to be tested.
I want to know how the fucking inmate can sell a car.
Yeah, and that's only, I think, one of the shady things that was going on in that jail.
The corruption in this police department is fucking bananas. The shit that they don't do, the shit that they're involved in, the shit that they cover up, I just can't. It is the textbook case for police corruption. If we could write a book about it and put it into a class for criminal justice of what police corruption could be, the Jefferson Davis Parish could be in a fucking textbook.
And I can't even get into all of it. Ethan Brown does it a bit in his book where he goes through just the history of all of the corruption, all of missing evidence and cases.
But this is a situation where I feel like it's atypical of what we normally see, but in this situation, it starts at the top.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas it's not just over to the side over here. This absolutely starts from the top. Like, this might be in their training.
I was going to say, you become a police officer. By the way, we cover this group of people.
And if you're not okay with that, then this is not the place for you.
Going back to the sale of this truck, if Tracy's account is accurate, if this inmate's account of what Hannah said is accurate, that Kristen, Frankie, Hannah, and Connie were all in Connie's truck, and this is potentially the murder scene and or where Kristen's body was transported, a very key piece of evidence was lost in this case. And if we want to be a little just more angry about this, I'm going to make you more mad. Yeah. Episode 2 may even make you more mad.
Everybody brings something to break.
Yeah.
Just all take a moment to go outside and throw something.
Ethan Brown, in his book, outlined that Sheriff Ricky Edwards had said he had no idea that the truck was potentially tied to Kristen's murder at all. Obviously, Warren Gary did a bad thing. He bought a car from an inmate. You can't do that. But I had no idea that there was evidence tied to Kristen Lopez's murder in that car. However, Ethan Brown looked deeper into the police files, and as he outlines in his book, investigators were well aware of this fact. In one of law enforcement's own reports, they indicate that Connie Seiler was one of the last people to see Kristen Lopez, and Paula Guillory, wife to Terry Guillory, who we've also talked about, indicated herself that she knew that Connie Seiler's, quote, vehicle was probably involved. Distrustful of the local law enforcement, as I think we all are now, Sergeant Jesse Ewing, who interviewed these inmates, actually handed the taped interviews over to a private investigator who then the tapes to the FBI.
So we have a good apple?
We have one good apple. There's going to be definitely 2 good apples that are in a authoritative role. Jesse Ewing really seemed worried about how all of these cases were being handled, and he didn't think that this would be handled appropriately if he just turned it over to the local law enforcement. So that's why he took those steps.
Good for him. I feel like we should send him like a cookie cake or something.
Yes, let's do it.
You are going to want to send him more than a cookie cake after the next thing I say. Jesse Ewing's fate in his career was bleak after this action. After the interviews, Ewing was charged with malfeasance in office, which stemmed from him not following the chain of custody for the evidence. I think that probably him turning these tapes over to the FBI are the only reason that we actually have them now. And Ethan Brown in his book had said that he was able to hear the tapes, but they weren't made public. Actually, in the documentary, you do hear some of the audio of these tapes. Jesse Ewing was fired after this incident.
Of course.
Warren Gary, on the other hand, who bought the truck, not immediately, but eventually was actually promoted by Sheriff Ricky Edwards to run the evidence room.
Oh my gosh.
This is a fucking circus. This isn't a real law enforcement.
How did the police force find out that the tapes made it to the FBI? Because clearly I would think there would be like a PSS, don't tell my coworkers.
If you have 2 good people in this case who knows who they're reporting it to that has to do their due diligence to not get caught, but is still going to expose the radicals.
And I assume with Jesse Ewing, it's not like he was just at the jail and inmates were like, oh, come here, I want to talk to you. He was alerted in some way that they wanted to talk to somebody. He ended up going over there. And so the local law enforcement knew that he was having conversations. So they might have been after the fact of, oh, where did those taped interviews go? And it might have come out that way too. But I think, like you're saying, David, these people that received the information might have needed to do something in an official capacity with it. I know we've jumped around a bit in the timeline. I wanted to add that in because it was interesting timing happening right on the heels of Whitney's body being found. So unfortunately, Whitney's case did not see any movement and no new leads came to fruition until 2009. So this was a couple years after Jesse Ewing and the tapes. This information actually came from Chad Richard, who we've already talked about. He was the one that allegedly was driving around with Jamie when they spotted Whitney's body in the middle of the road. In 2009, Chad Richard and Frankie Richard were actually at the same substance abuse treatment center. According to Chad, Frankie had told him that he had killed Whitney, as well as 2 of the other Jeff Davis 8 victims. However, Frankie didn't provide any of their names, and then used a 55-gallon barrel with chemicals to store the victims. According to Chad, he relayed Frankie's confession to staff at the rehab center, and Frankie was gone the next day. What I assume happened is obviously staff at the rehab center would have had to alert law enforcement that something like this happened, and Frankie just disappears from the treatment center, right back to his porch. Frankie Richard has never been charged in Whitney's murder, and it's unclear whether Chad's tip was taken seriously or not. Interestingly, Frankie had told investigators during an interview that he had purchased formaldehyde from funeral homes. And the idea was that he was maybe using the chemicals in some type of drug creation. According to Ethan Brown's book, there have been numerous witnesses who have provided tips that Frankie used barrels to store victims. However, none of those leads were seemingly ever followed up on. In the Showtime documentary, there was some of the police force that was interviewed, and a lot of the narrative that they were putting out there was that, oh, it's an open investigation, we can't comment, we have persons of interest in mind, but we're not naming them publicly. That was the narrative that was being spewed. And whether it was the one person that they've left out of the loop that they allowed to be on camera to agree to do this Showtime documentary, or the corruption is even deeper, that can be left up to speculation. So Whitney's body was found on May 12th, 2007. June of 2007 brought another victim. Although this victim was not part of the Jeff Davis 8 as a whole, I think it's important to include in our coverage based on its potential connection to the Jeff Davis case. On the evening of June 8th, 2007, a man named Stephen Gunter was having an argument with his girlfriend, Loretta, not to be confused with the first victim, Loretta, at their home in Lake Arthur, which was just outside of the Jennings area. It's about 10 miles. According to Loretta, on that evening, Stephen was very intoxicated. She said that after Stephen and her had gone inside for the night, she went out and disabled their car because I guess Stephen had a really bad habit of driving while he was drinking. So Loretta wanted to prevent him from doing that. So the next day, the fight continued between Stephen and Loretta well into the afternoon. The fight became physical at one point when Stephen pulled Loretta's arm as he was trying to grab the car keys from her. This public altercation prompted neighbors to contact the police. When officers first arrived on the scene, Stephen had locked himself inside the home. He was telling officers to go away, just leave me alone. The officers asked Loretta if Stephen was armed, to which she replied that he did own guns. Loretta attempted to tell the officer that the situation was under control. However, the police that were on scene still told Loretta to turn over her house keys. This situation started to escalate even further as more law enforcement arrived on the scene, including the LAPD, so the Louisiana Police Chief, Cheryl Vincent. Also present was Sheriff's Office Detective Chad Romero, and interestingly enough, the Jennings Parish Jail Warden, Terry Guillory. In an attempt to flush Stephen from the home, tear gas canisters were let off inside the residence. Terry Guillory, so mind you, the warden of the jail, then used a battering ram to break down the back door and entered the home. Terry Guillory was armed with a shotgun. Next, according to Terry Guillory, he announced his presence and found Stephen sitting on the sofa from where Stephen allegedly fired 2 shots at him. Terry Guillory then stated that he retreated to the kitchen and fired an estimated 5 to 6 shots, and Stephen collapsed to the ground. Stephen was pronounced dead at the scene, succumbing, as the coroner described, to multiple shotgun wounds. This scene was handled very poorly because after this all happened, Stephen was pulled from the home and left on the front lawn, just in the heat on the front lawn with a tarp covering him. Law enforcement claimed that they had reasonable cause to enter the scene due to Stephen's use of physical force against Loretta, and the Louisiana State Police investigation cleared Terry Guillory of any wrongdoing, citing that his use of deadly force was justified due to Stephen firing shots at him. Why Terry Guillory, who was the warden of the jail, who had no experience dealing with such situations, was the one to breach the scene, leaves many unanswered questions. Now, a little bit about Stephen. He not only had prior interactions with the Jeff Davis 8 victims, but also with Terry Guillory. Stephen was actually related by marriage to the future Jeff Davis 8 victim, Crystal Zeno. Stephen also spent time with the Jeff Davis 8 victims at a local bar called Tina's Bar, drinking with them. He also drank with Terry Guillory at local bars. Later on in statements, Terry tries to diminish this relationship and say, "Oh, I was just drinking at the same bar as Stephen. We weren't there together drinking." According to Stephen's sister, the coroner had called her to relay that he thought Stephen's death was a cover-up because Stephen did not have any gunpowder residue on his hands. Additionally, Stephen had gunshot wounds through both the palms of his hands and his wrists, possibly meaning that his hands were raised when he was shot, or at least that he wasn't holding a gun. Unfortunately, the coroner, Richard DuPont, is now deceased after succumbing to a battle with cancer. If this is a cover-up, that begs the question of why. One potential reason comes from interviews that Ethan Brown had with Stephen's family. Allegedly, just prior to his death, Stephen told family members that he had pertinent information about the murders of the Jeff Davis 8 victims. Law enforcement, on the other hand, perpetuated the idea that Stephen's death was a case of suicide by cop. Used to support this claim, law enforcement said that they allegedly found a suicide note written on Stephen's computer the night before he was killed. Stephen's family call into question the authenticity of this note due to some of the language that was used, including the use of the word daddy in reference to his children, which he apparently never did. According to his family, Stephen had no suicidal ideation or any prior suicide attempts. And I know we've talked in our cases a lot. It's hard to tell if somebody is having any type of suicidal ideations.
Mhm.
However, with this case, if Stephen was actually attempting to die by suicide by cop, why would he barricade himself inside the home? Why would he tell the officers to go away?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't he have come out onto the front porch
As
and just
in,
started
wouldn't you
shooting?
like run outside and be like, oh, here I am?
A lot of the cases we talked about where it's usually like the undetermined deaths where people are like, we don't think it could be suicide when they're trying to determine it being suicide. I don't know that there's been cases like this. So I think there's a big difference if is it suicide because of substance abuse or suicide by cop?
I think that's a good point. I was just trying to get at is, although his family saying he had no suicidal ideations, that obviously holds weight, but I think we've talked about it before. The case of Robin Williams, you nobody knew around him, but I think this one, like you said, is such a different set of circumstances than a lot of the other cases that we've speculated on of whether it was actually suicide or not. In August of 2007, a grand jury considered whether charges should be filed against Terry Guillory in relation to Stephen's death. The grand jury came back with a no true bill decision, meaning that they did not find any probable cause that a crime was committed. As the jail's warden, Terry Guillory had consistent contact with the Jeff Davis 8 victims while they were in custody. According to several witnesses, Terry Guillory handled the Jefferson Davis Parish jail like the Boudreaux Inn. The witnesses state that Terry Guillory arranged for female inmates to have sex with men and even released inmates in return for sexual favors. One female inmate even disclosed that while she was sharing a cell with the first Jeff Davis 8 victim, Loretta Chazon, she saw Terry Guillory come into her cell and have sex with Loretta. According to other accounts, Terry Guillory also failed to take action against a man named Mark Ivory, an employee at the jail who allegedly sexually assaulted and exposed himself to a female inmate, Lisa Allen, between 2006 and 2007. Lisa Allen reported these incidents to nurse Nina Ravy at the jail. Nina Ravy encouraged Terry Guillory to act on Lisa Allen's allegations because she believed them to be credible. However, Terry Guillory instead requested the assistance of the Louisiana State Police. Now, this may be protocol that if there is an allegation and you're the warden of the jail, you can't necessarily act on it. You may need an outside force, but I think there was more going on here. After an interview with nurse Nina Ravy by Trooper Jared Dobson, Nina Ravy was charged with making a false statement in the medical records to support a civil lawsuit filed by Lisa Allen related to the sexual abuse. Nina Ravy, like Jesse Ewing, lost her job. Dobson, the officer that interviewed Nina Ravy, on the other hand, went on to be a member of the task force that would later be set up to investigate the Jeff Davis 8 murders. Just the next month, in July of 2007, Jefferson Davis Parish saw the death of another prominent figure when Harvey Bird Dog Burley was killed inside of his home. The cause of death was due to stabbing. Harvey Bird Dog Burley was a witness to the shooting death of Leonard Crockett during the drug raid that was also witnessed by Jeff Davis 8 victim Kristen Lopez. Just before Burley's death, he told Mike Dubois the brother of victim Whitney Dubois, that he was close to finding out who had killed Whitney. So at this point, Swag Pack, I have thrown a lot at you. I think your emotional state could use a break as we digest some of this information. We have made our way through 4 of the 8 victims. We have also seen that people who have alleged to have information about these murders are ending up dead. So I think it's a good time to pause episode 1, and we will pick it back up in episode 2 to go through the rest of this really twisted story and really talk about these women and continue to give their cases coverage that I think is long overdue, and hopefully continue pressuring somebody in an authoritative role to really sit down and investigate these cases. So until next time, this is Speculating Wildly About Crime. I'm Carolina, and Swag Pack, we will see you next week.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our show today. We genuinely appreciate any and all support. We would love if you would please subscribe, like, comment, or download on any of your favorite platforms that you go to for podcasts. Did today's episode leave you with more to say, or have a theory that we didn't discuss, or even a case that you'd love to hear us talk about? Head on over to our Facebook discussion group. You can search SWACPod, SWACPOD discussion group, and leave any suggestions, comments, etc. there. To feel a little bit more comfortable via email, we can also be reached at swacpod@gmail.com. That's SWACPOD@gmail.com. Any and all feedback is incredibly helpful to us. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep speculating wildly.